outside.
All right, this is Chairman Mike McCoo calling to order the Willington School Building Committee special meeting of Friday, February 3rd at 2023 at 6:30 p.m. We'll get right to present to speak. We'll start in the room. Anybody in the room? No. We'll go to online. Give us a moment as we check the screen. If you have the yellow hand you can raise if you'd like to speak, go ahead. And if you don't have that capability, then feel free to unmute and call out your name. Just a reminder for anyone who's online about present to speak tonight, because this is a special meeting and we anticipate it to be shorter. There's only one agenda item. This is the only present to speak for this meeting. There is not one at the end also. There's your sign. Okay, moving on. New business, consideration of auditorium as a second referendum question. If we all think way back to 2 nights ago, we passed a motion to recommend a new school without auditorium. Lots of discussion was had. But then we also had some lengthy discussion about what were our options for the auditorium. There certainly was some public interest in an auditorium, not to the level of the new school public interest, but there is some interest. And we debated a couple of things, such as what are the legalities, what's the right process, not wanting to risk messing up the OSCGR process, and basically just needing a day or two to gather some more information. In the time in between the meeting 2 nights ago and tonight, we've had the opportunity to consult some with Scott Pellman. Erica has had the opportunity to consult with bond counsel, and we've also had a little bit of an opportunity to review numbers again. All of you board members have those updated charts that I put together with the help of Phil and Scott over the last 24 hours or so. And we'll post those on the screen, and after this meeting, as long as everyone is okay with them, we'll get them out to the public. Since they'll be presented here tonight anyway, we'll get them out to the public. But that's sort of the background of how we got here. What I do know from the discussion with Scott is that the premise that I was bringing up during the last meeting, that the cost of the auditorium is essentially $6 million. And even though part of that is reimbursable in the state's program, the added square footage of the auditorium then also incurs a penalty, which means it ends up coming out at about a wash. And if you look at those numbers, that was part of the reason for developing that chart that you guys got in email, because it helps show where we are with a waiver, without a waiver, and all that. Why don't you go ahead and screen share that, Phil, just since I'm on a roll right now. So that can certainly help with the discussion. So if we look just at the top line, new school, no auditorium, which is the part that we have approved to recommend already. The top line assumes that there was not a waiver approved. So then you see what the reimbursement rate would be, and then if you move down one line, you see adding the auditorium, you'll notice that the project budget goes up by almost exactly $6 million. And then the reimbursement percentage goes down, and that's that penalty for the extra square footage, which makes a difference in the column to the right. The remaining cost to be incurred by the taxpayers of Willington is, in this case, a $7 million change. So a $6 million auditorium costs us $7 million in this scenario without the waiver. Now, of course, when you move down to the bottom lines, those 2 lines assume the waiver gets approved. The math is a little different, and we have a fairly strong feeling that the waiver will be approved, but that is by no means a guarantee. So if you look at the approved waiver, those two lines, now when you look at the delta, a $6 million auditorium makes a $6 million difference, basically. So with a waiver, basically to sum it up, with a waiver, there's no cost benefit to keeping it a separate project or any of the other things we discussed the other night that I was worried about. If we don't get the approved waiver, then there is a challenge because adding the auditorium within the OSCGR funding makes it cost $1 million more. So that was what I was trying to wrestle with the other night. Now we can see it in actual numbers. I guess I'll stop rambling at this point and go to the first. Catherine, go ahead.
Okay, I wasn't sure if we were accepting questions, but thank you, Mike. I just wanted to clarify under new school, no auditorium with a waiver in the approved waiver, the 53.21%, that represents approval of 100% of our square footage that we're presenting. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
That's our maximum reimbursement rate.
Right. Okay. That's percentage wise is our best case scenario. And if you look at the final column on the right, dollars wise for the taxpayers, that's also our best scenario.
Okay. And just a question for Scott, how are you pretty confident that that we can get the full 100% if we prove that the formula is flawed like we did in the early on?
Well, I think, Catherine, I believe you were at the meeting with the state, and I know Phil was, so you heard Michelle's comments firsthand. I certainly can't speak for the state.
Yeah.
You know, I think we have a very strong argument for, and we'll absolutely push for 100% waiver. I don't think that the ed spec that the town and the board put together, I think it's a very reasonable ed spec. I don't think there's not a lot of fat there.
Yeah.
You know, so I think they did a really good job putting it together. So, you know, certainly that's our goal, but I can't comment any further on that as to what the state will ultimately decide.
No, I understand. I was more curious if they would reduce the 100% down to anything else, like 80% or 90%. But
could I just make a suggestion? We don't use 180% and stuff. Let's just say full waiver or partial waiver. The only reason I want to do that is I don't want anyone in the public to get confused about the percentages.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense.
Let's just use the percentages for what the actual middle column is. Jim, go ahead.
Hold on, let me unmute. You guys can hear me?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So a couple of questions, Scott. So the figures you pulled up, the new construction without the auditorium factors in costs for a stage and for audio video, you know, theater lighting, et cetera, for a gymnatorium type setup, correct?
That is correct.
So did the cost with that auditorium discount that? I guess what I'm trying to get at is the $6 million delta with the waiver. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, are we spending money on an auditorium or a stage, a gymnatorium setup that isn't factored into that auditorium cost? I'm sorry, I'm phrasing this very poorly.
You know, I think I know where you're going, Jim. So, and I think, Phil, you can chime in, but what we discussed with the scenario without a full auditorium is that we would utilize one of the music spaces similar to your current configuration and utilize that space as the stage, tied on to
so you're capitalizing
the gymnasium,
the classroom, so there really is no cost increase. Okay, so it is essentially a true square foot add for auditorium. It's a straight
correct
delta. Okay.
Yeah, you still need the second music program space, however, in the option without the auditorium, that space would have an additional purpose. Again, trying to maximize efficiencies within the building and reduce cost.
So 2 quick follow-up questions on that. Have you, obviously, we're assuming the costs we have for the auditorium are as if they were built as a single project. If we opt to not go with an auditorium now, or not allow the voters to choose that, have we factored in, I mean, there's going to be a delay. If it becomes a later project, a separate project, there's going to be escalation to any future construction. So I guess the question I have is, have you done any calculations on what you're anticipating a square foot cost for a, new construction on an auditorium as a standalone project without state funding, with or without it? And do we have any sense of what that escalation does to that $6 million delta if it were 3 years from now we decide we want an auditorium project?
Yeah, I mean, it's really based on, how far out, so is it another 3 years after the new school is completed? Certainly right now we're looking at escalation costs of about 5.5% per year. Yeah. You would have additional design fees, to incorporate a new auditorium within the design as a complete package. There's efficiencies in the design. Yep. Tying onto a new building, getting another architect, construction manager, escalation fees. Yeah, it would certainly be more, but it really depends on how, 3 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, it's not going to be a $6 million ad anymore.
Yeah, I think that's the critical point I want,
yeah, it's $6 million in today's dollars following the schedule that we have on the table as far as completion. But if it becomes a future project, most likely, yes, it will be more expensive than the current $6 million estimated.
So I guess that's my point. Even without the waiver, I know there's a cost premium there that, delay adds costs. So delay will add impact to this project.
And again, the reason, and I know we've talked about this previously, but I thought it would be good to clarify tonight. The reason that there is we'll say, quote unquote, penalty is by state statute. The state will only pay for an auditorium that it serves half the student population. So that would be an auditorium for approximately 200 students. And really, an auditorium of that size doesn't really make a lot of sense in a community. It's quite small. So when I reviewed that with Phil, I provided both a middle school and a number of high school auditoriums that were in that 400 to 425 student range for consideration by the board and by Phil, and that's what they used to develop the ed spec.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm good.
Gary?
Thank you. So the other night we had started discussing essentially 2 options here, which we were not sure about. One was whether we would add the auditorium as part of the OSCGR school project. And then we had talked about, would it be possible to add it as a separate project, right? Add a second question about a separate project on the auditorium. Have we looked into whether that's possible? Is that still possible? Are we thinking that that's possible? Are we going to get to that?
Well, I wouldn't, if you were going to build simultaneously, but try and do it as a separate project, I wouldn't recommend that. You're for the state audits and all, you're going to have a complete accounting of the project. So in essence, in the scenario you're talking about, Gary, is you would be doing a second set of documents and bidding it out separately. So you could have 2 different mechanical trade contractors, 2 different masons trying to, work together and bringing that together. So the potential coordination or finger pointing of who owned the connection, as well as the design. It would be, if you were going to put out a separate bid package, putting those packages together, there would be additional costs from the design team, the construction manager to do that. But Scott, you would have to bid it as a separate package. So we wouldn't recommend that approach.
Scott, I just want to add a comment in there. One of the things we discussed as one of the nuances of this topic was possibly as an ad alternate within the same. And really where we were hung up was, do we do we need to keep this away from the OSCGR thing? Do we need a line between the main project and the ad alternate because of the potential penalty with OSCGR formula? Or is what we're talking about enough of a separation? You know, we're just not sure how to navigate that to get the best result.
Yeah, if it was an ad alternate, in again, as long as the architects designed it, you know, specifically so the building could be either not constructed, you bring your main utilities, your fire sprinkler and everything else, but you know, they would have a little bit, you know, a couple of extra sheets, because if you weren't putting the auditorium on, it would become an exterior wall. If you were putting the auditorium on, that where that joined the building, it would become an interior wall with doors, a few changes. So there'd be a little bit of additional expense for the architect. But again, if you include that option when you're putting out the architect's RFP, that's the point where they're going to be hungry, and you know, they're going to sharpen their pens, and you know, you're going to get the best price for that overall package. So yes, you could do it as an alternate, and then the state would, you know, you'd have a very specific number that's a separate number that we could use to track, you know, financially with the state to either include or not include that portion of the structure.
So that would allow us to possibly keep it out of the square footage penalty, because we'd keep it out of the funding if we did it that way, if we chose to.
Well, I guess if the problem is you're still going to have to prorate the design fees, management fees, CM fees, all of those portions of the project to the main building project and the auditorium.
Right.
So it's not a matter of just separating out, you know, and I think if you were going to pay for it yourself, you'd probably just include it as an alternate with the state. Because you're going to have to prorate all of those soft costs, and it becomes a bit involved. You know, it can be done, but it gets quite complicated.
Thank you. Gary, I kind of jumped in on your question there.
No, that's okay. I mean, I think I understand. One thing to what Scott said at first about, you know, multiple contractors or multiple, I guess, lead contractors. Would it not be likely that the same contractors would bid on the auditorium piece if they already had essentially had the job?
Well, I think you'd probably bid it at the same time. You could bid it separately, but it's not a guarantee that you would get the same contractors for both. You know, and you know, one's going to be wanting to try and finish up. You know, it could be a challenge if you got two different contractors, you know, coming to that same point in the building at the same time.
I could see that. So I guess I'm trying to get down to what we're saying here, because you know, the risk here is $1 million, basically paying $1 million, you know, for nothing in my mind.
I'm not sure where you're coming up with $1 million.
Okay, well, so the graph or the chart that Phil and Mike showed before, if we don't get the waiver, I guess that's what I'm talking about. If we don't get the waiver, the full waiver, it's a $7 million auditorium project, right? That's what was showed. Is that correct, Mike or Phil or anybody?
It's a $6 million project that costs us $7 million.
Thank you. Right.
Right, because yeah, and that's calculated in all the soft costs. Contingencies are considered ineligible until they're applied to something. So they're an ineligible cost from the start. Once a contingency is applied to a change order, if the change order is eligible construction, then it becomes eligible. But the initial calculations. So yeah, it's not just the hard construction cost, but it's a penalty on the prorated, all of the ineligible costs and all of the soft costs.
Right. So to me, that's the risk here. Obviously, I hope that we get 100%, the waiver approved at 100%. But that's where my mind's going. So I haven't heard another alternative similar to what we were thinking about the other night. And so I'm glad we didn't vote the other night, but I'm still not sure about it. So maybe some other people have other ideas.
Thank you, Gary. Ann?
I think Gary gave me a great segue. So in other words, let me just clarify one thing. The penalties are only applied in the first set of numbers, correct? And the second set of numbers, there is no penalty when we have the waiver. Is that correct?
Well,
Essentially, Scott.
yeah, yes, but again, with the auditorium, with the waiver, again, the state only pays for 50% of the auditorium. So they'll prorate whatever the cost is of an auditorium. They'll only pay for an auditorium for 200 kids, not for 400. So the cost for that extra 200, it's the construction cost, and then they prorate the architect's fees. So if that was 5% of the overall construction cost to construct that area, and I'm just throwing numbers out, so these aren't actual numbers, but if it was 5%, then 5% of the architect's fee would also be ineligible, because they're not going to pay for the architect to design something that's not eligible.
Okay, so my question is, could we apply for the auditorium with the new school? And then if we do not get the waiver, could we then ask the state if we could just build the school without the auditorium?
Well, certainly, I think if the ed spec was written that way, and if it was done as an alternate, yeah, you could modify the grant. I mean, you could put it into the initial grant. I might suggest again doing it as an alternate, but yeah, then we could have that discussion, and we could potentially take it out and file an updated ed spec and budget. But you're going to want to approve, the overall money. The referendum would have to approve the amount first.
Yes.
I don't see that why the state would be negative if you taking something back out of the project. They may question saying, the public approved this, they wanted this, now you're taking it out. I could see comments being made from the state on that level. But certainly, I mean, I have amended grant applications in the past. Typically, we've seen changes in population that are to the benefit of a community. We've gone back to the state and we've said, hey, we just got an extra 50 kids we weren't expecting. And that's been a very positive thing for reimbursement rates. Because again, students allow you to build a bigger building.
Right. Now, the other consideration I just want to bring out is if we did wait and do something at a later date, we're putting our children in that construction phase again. So that's one consideration about waiting, if we were to do it at a later date, once the school is up and running.
Yeah, I do think putting an auditorium addition on to a building that's just an applied, let's say it's an applied box, I'm going to make it very simple, is very different from going into the building and constructing areas and moving kids around. And you've got portions of the building that are renovated, that aren't renovated. You're taking ceilings down, very, very different. So in addition, putting that onto a building could be constructed without, except for maybe the summer months where you make the physical connection between the two, could be constructed with minimal impact to students.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
You could even construct it all in the summer if you did the right design, the right contractor. You could do a summer slammer.
Very helpful.
I've been involved in jobs where we've done way harder than that in one summer, but maybe we had a bigger budget.
Right.
Brianna.
Sorry, I'm looking at documents in my email trying to answer this question myself, but you beat me. So I just, can the full student body and staff gather in the gym, music room, stageatorium, or is that also half? Like the one that we have on the ed spec now? That's what I'm trying to find.
There's no penalty for that. That's just
No, I just want to know how many could everyone fit in there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you're talking about the combination gymnatorium.
Yes, right. Music room, stage.
If we did not have the auditorium, could we get all 415 kids plus the staff into that room?
Yep.
Definitely.
Yeah, I would think so.
Probably more so by code calculation, by quite a bit.
Okay.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, you would potentially have a combination of bleachers and then floor seating. So you could bring in chairs, set it up on the floor. So, yeah, I mean, typically a gymnasium, you could get full-size gymnasium with bleachers. You're probably looking in the 700 to 800 person range.
Exactly that, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, who wants to speak? Who hasn't spoken yet on this? And then we're gonna go back around to some people who have their hands up again.
I just have a question for Scott, that's okay.
Go.
So Scott, I think Gary's questioning the $1 million difference. And the $1 million difference is all through OSCGR. So if you bid it as an alternate, that's still through OSCGR, correct?
Yes.
So I just want to make sure, because the other night, what Mike was sharing was project outside and removing OSCGR from that process. And that $1 million difference, and I'm not sure if this is what Gary's getting at, is that $1 million difference really probably isn't $1 million, because by the time you do all the work, because you have to separate your grant application from that additional work. Is that what your point is?
No, it would be one grant application. I mean, you could, again, potentially bid it as an alternate. You would ask the CM to bid that portion of the building, and the way the drawings would be structured is to bid that separately. And then you've got to, you track the funds, you track change orders. In the overall, what they would do is they would just take the overall square footage and they would revise your reimbursement rate. Again, down as we've shown from, I think, the 51 to 53 to the 50%.
Yeah, but Scott, that's through OSCGR. And what Mike was saying is that if we wrote the grant application with just the school, there's no auditorium, right? And we just did the auditorium on our own as a separate project, but at the same time, no OSCGR. You're gonna have to stop the electric, the sprinkler system at the gate, at the door to that auditorium.
Right.
And so is there an added cost to do the additional work to make, and this is what you were talking about with the finger pointing, I think part of that is the same thing. It's the same scenario, but is there an added cost to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think what you would have to do, and we will have to work it out with the construction manager. I would bid it as an alternate. What you're saying is we're not going to go through the state, so we're going to fund it wholly. We're going to fund it 100%. So let's say the town funds that $6 million out of, we're not going to go through OSCGR. What we would have to do then again is prorate. So we're not going to ask every single soft cost, try and get two costs. Okay, Mr. CM, what's it going to cost to manage the whole school project? And then what would it cost to manage the auditorium? Or architect, what are you going to design the whole school versus design the auditorium? I think what you do is you would just then prorate those fees and you'd make that ineligible to the main project and then just fund the hard construction cost.
Okay.
Right, so does that get us out of the penalty? That was my whole reason for bringing up that scenario. If we're clear from the beginning, when we apply to OSCGR, that we are building this project, we have an ad alternate for the auditorium, but we are not paying for it in the grant. We're paying for it with separate funds. Would that keep us away from the penalty?
Well, again, what you're claiming is the penalty was the percentage. It was the ineligible construction cost prorated of the soft costs. So that's where you were getting that.
Yeah, I don't think the conversation even needs to be about the prorate as much as the general topic of, can we exclude the finances for the auditorium from OSCGR or not?
You could, but again, a portion of the design fee is going to design that. So that would have to be prorated out. That's
right. I get that. I'm saying stop talking about the prorate. Just can we separate it, including the prorate? Can we separate it or not separate it? Or is OSCGR going to say, well, you're just trying to do an end run around that?
No, I don't think they would do that. Again, I think we'd have to just come up with a methodology to break the costs out so OSCGNR, it would be clear to what they're funding and what they aren't.
Okay.
No. But there's more cost to it.
I think that's what I think. Is there savings to that? That's the question.
Right, well, so the thing that gets me is that if we were not building a new school and we were just building an auditorium, wouldn't we go to OSCGR and get funding for half of that auditorium? Scott, couldn't we, if we were only
Yes,
considering building an
yes, you
auditorium?
could.
So
Yeah.
the $6 million auditorium would become a $3 million auditorium to the Willington taxpayers.
Right, and if it was a $200,000 design fee, it would be 100 and 100. And if you had $1 million in contingency starting out, it would be 500 and 500 ineligible.
Right, so then what ends up happening is by including this in any way, it's costing the Willington taxpayers more money to build it. That's what I'm trying to drive out of the conversation. How do we maximize the benefit to the Willington taxpayer? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
You get the waiver.
Right.
You get the waiver, right?
I think.
Exactly.
I can't say, guys, just not to jump in, but the
Go on,
complex,
your hand up for a while anyway, Jim.
the complexity of doing this as a separate project, doing it as a separate project is adds so much complexity that I think you're putting yourself a little bit at risk as well of all of the unknowns. It really is.
I think we agree it has to be an
Yeah.
ad alternate. It can't be a separate project.
Yeah, no, but yeah, no, it definitely needs to be designed and it definitely needs to be apart and constructed at the same time. I don't know whether the problem is, and what Scott, I think, is alluding to, is there's going to be soft costs. You're going to have a penalty in soft costs, you know, just from separating some of that out or trying to separate some of that out. So I'm not seeing much benefit to, you know.
I mean, you're just moving the money.
$1
Yeah, you're just moving the money from one bucket to another. The ineligible design fees are going to be the same in either scenario. You know, and again, I mean, we've been saying do it as an alternate, but I think if the townspeople so choose to go forward, you know, I'm not even sure what an alternate does for you. I mean,
Right.
you know, except for the standpoint of bidding it as a separate fee, then you can accurately prorate the soft costs. Typically, the state's going to look for a methodology to do this, and we have two options. We can do it by square footage, and we can say that, okay, the auditorium is, and I'm just going to pick a number, 8% of the overall building project. So 8% of the cost, we're going to, and they're giving us half of that. So 4% of the soft costs would be ineligible. Now, if you bid it out, and let's say that the construction value of the auditorium was less than 8% of the total construction cost, then it might behoove you to do it that way. Typically, auditoriums are fairly expensive spaces. It's a large volume. It's got heavy mechanicals. I would recommend doing it on a square footage basis to prorate the soft costs and not bidding it as a separate number. I think you'd do better. There'd be an advantage to that because you're taking one of your more expensive spaces and blending it in with the entire school where you've got some spaces that are a little more cost effective to build.
All right. Catherine?
Yeah, I guess I appreciate the outside of the box thinking about how we can save the town taxpayer money by not, separating out the auditorium, but I honestly don't see any benefit to doing that, nor would I recommend it. Being in the industry, I would not recommend doing that. I think if one of the ways we could possibly do it is go all in to OSCGR with the full value of the school and the auditorium. And if we wanted to ask the bidders to just give us a line item for the cost of the auditorium, and if we decide down the road that maybe after construction starts or when we get the, when we're going through the scope of the project and we need to carve out the auditorium, at least there's a number there that we could change order it out of the project. I don't recommend it, but I'm just
Too
saying
expensive?
we could
Like if it
possibly
came
do
in too
that.
expensive?
What's that?
You mean like if it came in too expensive, that would be an
Right.
easy way to value engineer it out, would be cut off
Exactly.
that line item.
Right, but we would benefit by at least knowing what that dollar value is, because maybe it's not as much as we think, But anyway, I just wanted to say, I don't recommend carving it out as a separate project. I don't see how that would benefit us. Nor do I think we should carve it out and do it as a future project, because then it's going to cost even more money. And who knows if we would even be able to have it come to the table,
If the only way that if it's in the ed spec and if it's in the drawings that are approved by the state, at that point you've got to build it.
Oh, okay.
Because people would do that and the state would say, hey, I approved this project.
Yeah.
This is what you said you needed, and now you just cut a whole wing of the building off. Well, they're going to take all that money back.
Yeah.
You're just, they're
Well,
not going to pay for you to.
50%. It's only, it would only be 50%, right?
Right, but they're going to take their money back. So
Yeah.
you wouldn't want to do that. I mean, at the end of schematic design, but again, I think you really need to just decide what the project is and take that project to the state.
I agree.
Peter?
Just a point of clarification for me, Scott or Phil, is the auditorium in our ed spec now, or is it not?
It is. It is in the ed spec.
So does that then, if I can ask a follow-up question, make this essentially a mandatory option, not a mandatory addition to this project for the town?
Not necessarily, because you could achieve, this was, I think the Board of Ed realized that was one of the things that was an addition that was expensive, but they could achieve it also through a gym cafetorium concept.
I think maybe what Peter's getting at is the ed spec would require a minor revision to align with what was approved by the town.
Right.
Yeah.
If it was not an auditorium, Scott.
Correct. Yeah. If the auditorium is not chosen as part of the referendum, then the ed spec would need to be modified to reflect that.
So I'm sorry, I'm still confused. So if the auditorium is not offered as an alternate or part of the base scope, does the cafetorium meet our ed spec requiremements?
The Board of Ed would have to approve that, but I think the answer would be yes, because whether it's a gymatorium or cafetorium, that's essentially what they have now. And I think as long as it was built to that, which is what is in Scott's price, there's an expectation that it would meet that. Where the cost, and you're welcome. And I think this is important for people to understand too, is that along those same lines, if you were to say, let's do it in 10 years, we're going to build the gymatorium now. If it passes, the gymatorium is part of this project. And so, Scott, tell me if I'm wrong, we're going to be penalized even more if we tried to build the auditorium in 10 years, because we've built the square footage in now for a gymatorium, and now you want to add an auditorium, and now you're adding even more square footage.
Yeah, potentially, but it also depends on your student population. If you get a big influx of students, then you may be able to justify the square footage in a larger auditorium. So there's, if I had the crystal ball.
Yeah, fair enough. So what I've gotten out of the conversation so far is that it seems like we have to hope for the waiver, because then that keeps us from getting the $1 million penalty on the gym, on the auditorium, I'm sorry. And there seems to be in the community and on this committee interest in having this option available for the referendum. And if that's the case, then we probably should, which Erica may want to comment on her discussions with the bond council. We probably should be considering adding a second question to the referendum, which is the segue for Erica to talk about that second question.
Sure, I don't know if Justin wants to.
Justin, you want to jump in on that before she goes, or?
I think I probably want to listen first because you probably answer my question.
Okay, so I had the opportunity to speak with our attorney as well as our bond counsel, and I'll just remind you all, our bond counsel is legal advice. So myself, Phil, and our business manager met with Lori Hall this week, yesterday, and so talked with her through what was happening. She had the benefit of knowing what our discussion was and what our vote had been, because she had watched our meeting. So that really helped. So what she says is, yes, you can. It is not unusual to have an added question. If you're thinking in terms of a high school, you could add, do you want a pool? Do you want a turf field? Those things could be additional questions. So that is possible. And your action then would be to recommend to the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance to consider the addition of an additional question for XYZ. You would, she would caution you away from changing the vote that you had already made on Wednesday. There had been some discussion of that at some point in the meeting. She was very clear to say that would put you in conflict with yourself, and that would certainly not be recommended. So you could add a second question, and your action would simply, remember, you're not choosing the referendum questions. You're simply recommending to the Board of Selectmen to move forward the process through the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance. So it can be done, and you could ask that a second question be added for an auditorium. Does that answer your question?
That answers my question.
Okay.
Thank you for taking my segue.
Yes.
Okay, more conversation? Brianna.
I like that option a lot. One thing I'm thinking though is, Phil, I don't want to send you back out on your roadshow, but that is going to require some more explanation and clarification for the public.
Sure.
And just make sure they know exactly what the differences are and what that comes down to. And I think knowing that all of the word yada yada auditorium in the gym stands regardless, I think that's important too.
Yep, agreed. Peter?
Well, just perhaps a silly question, but is it possible that, are these standalone questions? Is it possible the auditorium could be approved and the base project not? Does that ever happen?
No, they would be worded. You have to have an if then.
It's additional.
So the language connects to two proposals. One is contingent upon the other.
The second, any additionals are contingent upon the main, yes.
Thank you.
More discussion?
Justin's question.
Justin, I assume your hand went down. I assume your question got answered.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't changing our motion we had the other night. So this is going to be in addition to making sure we're following that process. Yep.
Should I try a motion?
Go for it.
I move that we recommend a second question be added to the upcoming referendum about the school project for the taxpayers to approve a auditorium.
Second.
Okay, discussion on the motion. Catherine?
Doesn't this committee have to first take a vote on whether or not they support an auditorium?
That's what we're doing right now.
No, the motion you made was to add a second question for the referendum. It
For
didn't
the
ask,
auditorium.
right, but that's add a second question for the voters. That's not us who voted
It's worded the same way we worded our motion the other night. It's the same process. We did not the other night first vote to decide if we liked the school project. Our only motion the other night was to recommend for a referendum for the taxpayers to approve a new school without an auditorium. And now we're adding the next one. So we're following the same process.
If this is a no vote, then that's your answer, Catherine.
Right,
A
exactly.
no vote
Good
is
point.
the answer that you are all not in favor of moving that to the referendum.
Correct.
Is
Right.
that in fact what the motion was? Was for a vote for a new school? I don't remember hearing
Yes.
that part, but,
It's a new school without an auditorium.
and it was for the referendum. It wasn't just to get our consideration of what we wanted.
No, it was us recommending out of committee
Project.
that would be the project. And now we're doing the exact same thing with this second piece. We're recommending out of our committee to start the process to add the second question for the auditorium.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Jim?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, I just want to say that I do think, particularly given the feedback, that although I think it's important to give the town the choice on this. I believe I said it the other night, given the cost implications, I don't think it's something that we could have gone out of the bat and been the only recommendation, but I do, there does seem to be quite a bit of support for this in the community, and let them make the decision to say that, yes, there is enough support, and yes, we do want to proceed with this, but now is the time to do that and to give them that choice. So that's all I'll say. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, I just want to, I guess, be a counterbalance to some of the commentary and say that I'm not favorable to adding this to the referendum question because I'm concerned about additional cost. And I don't think it's clear to the community that this represents an expansion of the project and more cost. And if you were following our conversation tonight, it sounds like we're getting something for nothing, which is not the case. And in fact, in the worst case scenarios with no waiver, we could be penalized and the cost could even be greater. I think it's important for us to focus on the base scope, which I'm concerned is overscoped and over budgeted for this town. And adding this will only compound that problem, and I do not support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, just one thing on the, I don't know, based on your work schedule, if you had the opportunity to review the emails from today yet and look over that chart at all that we had on the screen. I very frankly, that's an effort on my part with help from Phil and Scott to work to make those things even clearer that you're bringing up. I agree that we have to communicate this all carefully to the community. And so that's why I'm striving to find new ways to express what we've been dealing with. And I'll keep on doing that, and we'll all keep on working together to try to make that message better as we go from this night to the next step and the next step. So that hopefully, just as we've tried so far, we'll just keep on getting better and better at making sure whoever comes to vote knows really what they're voting on.
If I could just add to that, Mike, I think it's very important that because we are going to referendum without the waiver numbers, that we always talk about these scopes and costs in that context, not dangling the possibility of getting waivers that, as Scott himself has said, we have no assurance they even exist.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
Peter, one thing that's really important, and this will be part of our kind of marketing and continuing, for educating people, is that the number on the referendum will have absolutely nothing to do with the reimbursement rate. You actually have, your referendum question will be your total cost.
So I understand.
It'll be that 60 million or 66 million. And that's what you'll see on the And that's why we also have to educate people on why that's there and not there, what we would be reimbursed on.
If I could just clarify one comment, just so there isn't confusion. Space waivers do exist, and we've seen space waivers used a lot on a number of projects in the past. However, the state will not comment or coordinate a space waiver until you file your grant application. And you can't file the grant application until you have a successful referendum. So if you recall, we talked about it months ago. It's the chicken and the egg. But space waivers do exist. It's not something that would be unique to Willington. They have been granted in the past. But again, unfortunately, we cannot engage in that dialogue until we have submitted a grant application.
Right. Anne? Can you unmute?
When I looked at the survey, 42% of the people who voted for the new school also wanted an auditorium. So that's a large number. So I think it's good that we give them the opportunity to participate in this decision. Another thing that Phil had said at one point is when they met with OCGR, they said it was a good thing for a middle school to have an auditorium. I hope I'm not saying something wrong there, but I think we may have a little bit of their support there. And once again, I want to say the piece about the waiver. Perhaps if we can figure it out so that if we do not get the waiver and it's going to cost $7 million, maybe we could just stay with the school alone. Just to put that idea back out on the table. Thank you.
Gary?
Thanks. Just very quickly, I think that we need to give the voters the option on this, and that's what this is doing. So I think that's important. I also want to reiterate, Peter had made a good point about communicating this additional cost to the community. I know that on the referendum itself, it will say an additional amount, right? So it'll be clear about the additional amount. So that's one way, but I think there's other ways that we can do that, prior to the referendum. And then thirdly, I think we really need to, from here on, start pushing our legislative delegation on this. There's an opportunity here, I think, to get some state funding for this. I know that that's not really our job, but I want to make it clear that that's something I think we really need to get going on as soon as maybe after tonight. Thank you.
If I may, I just, again, a word of caution here. If you are going to go in and start discussing a space waiver with the state, if you've already gone ahead to your state legislatures ahead of time, you're going to back them into a corner. We've seen this happen in the past. So I would just be very cautious on how far and at what point you engage your legislators. It could absolutely be a good and helpful thing, but I think the timing is critical.
Okay, so maybe not after tonight, but the rest of it stands. Thank you.
It is definitely on the radar, Gary, and you should help us keep it on the radar. We just have to wait for the right time.
We're ready to talk to them and they're ready to talk to us when the town needs them.
Yeah,
I think that's the important piece there.
right. Catherine?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify my earlier question about why I thought the committee had to vote first. I totally agree with everybody when they said we need to give the voters a choice. I totally agree with that. My question about whether our SBC needed to vote first, that was more of a process thing. So anyway, I just want to clarify that and also state that I agree with what Gary was saying in that we definitely do have to give them a choice and show what that additional dollar amount is on the referendum. But I also want to say we have already done that in what the communications that have been shared by Phil. With the mailers, everything that we've done so far, there has been a category that says new school with an auditorium, new school without an auditorium. But I do agree when we submit it for referendum vote that the cost is actually on there, I think is what you guys were talking about.
Right.
Thank you.
Any other comments on the motion? Go ahead.
I don't know if Ann still wants to raise her hand up. I just, to Peter's comments, regardless of how we feel, if the outcome is that this group moves forward the recommendation. And a second question, and the second question will read something to the effect of, shall the town of Willington appropriate an additional X amount of dollars if a new pre-K through grade 8 school is approved? So if it ended up with more votes than the school, and the school didn't pass, it would be a moot point, because the question was if A is approved, then B. So the language all throughout this process will continue to be, if this, then this. Does that make sense, Peter?
Thank you, Erica.
We got some of the language on the process today, so I'm reading on my phone the very tiny script of the very long.
emails.
Well, they're very, very specific information so that, all the bases are covered here. But that is one that's very clear, and it's important. It's an important question for him to ask and for us to note to people.
Okay, any more discussion on the motion? All right, let's do a roll call vote.
You want me to do it?
Sure.
I've got everyone's names listed.
All right.
All right, Brianna.
Aye.
Ralph.
No.
Justin.
Yes.
Peter.
No.
Anne.
We got
That's
the
a yes,
thumbs
a
up.
thumbs up, yes. Gary.
Aye.
Jim.
We'll go aye.
Catherine.
Yes.
Mike.
Yes.
And I will note that Chris Talona is not present.
Okay, motion carries.
3, 4, 5.
I believe that
7.
concludes our business for tonight. Again, thank you to everyone for reacting quickly, being ready for tonight, and giving up time on your Friday night. So I'll entertain a motion for adjournment. And I'll second that. All those in favor, please say aye and wave goodbye, and thank you again.
Aye and bye.
Aye, bye.
Bye. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Good weekend, guys. Stay warm.